Welcome back to another deep dive. We are skipping the broad overviews today and going straight into an exclusive look at a very passionate, tight-knit subculture, one that is operating right above your head. We are talking about grassroots general aviation.
Right, which is a subculture that operates entirely differently from, the commercial aviation sector most of us interact with. When you book a commercial flight, you're dealing with massive international hubs, TSA checkpoints, corporate logistics.
The dreaded middle seat.
Oh, absolutely, the middle seat. But the grassroots sector, it's driven by local airfields, community volunteerism, and pilots who fly these smaller aircraft simply because they're deeply, deeply invested in the discipline and the history of flight.
It's a whole different world. The March 2026 issue of Flightlines. That's the official newsletter of the Colorado Pilots Association, or the CPA.
A great organization.
Truly. And the mission for our discussion today is to really map out how the specific community operates. We're going to examine how they balance a century of flying tradition with honestly, the stark realities of modernizing their infrastructure. We will look at the literal dollars and cents required to keep these local runways open.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today you are going to hear about a 102-year-old pilot navigating the Rocky Mountains, the rigid 10 commandments of aviation gatherings, and how high school drone soccer is actively trying to salvage the talent pipeline for the entire industry.
Drone soccer, I love that. But
Yeah.
the contrast in that lineup perfectly illustrates the tension within general aviation right now. You have this industry anchored by highly technical, heavily regulated machinery, but its actual survival depends entirely on grassroots human effort.
It's people, yeah. It's an army of volunteers and mentors. They're the ones keeping these local airfields from being swallowed up by commercial real estate development, or simply just, aging out of existence.
You mentioned aging out, which actually brings me to a photograph in this newsletter that really, it sets the tone for the community's dedication. There's this feature on a man named Walt Barbo.
Oh, yeah. What a story.
Right. He is celebrating his 102nd birthday, and he is doing it by flying a Cessna Centurion through the snow-capped Colorado Rocky Mountains. And for anyone listening who knows aircraft, a Cessna Centurion is not some basic trainer. It's a high-performance, complex, single-engine plane. It's heavy, it has retractable gear, and it requires a significant cognitive load to operate. To be managing that aircraft in the Rockies at 102 years old seems almost impossible.
It requires immense situational awareness. And physical coordination, too.
Yeah.
Flying over the Rockies is notoriously unforgiving.
I can imagine.
The weather patterns shift rapidly. The high altitude drastically affects engine performance. The downdrafts can be severe. So Walt Barbo, doing this at 102, it highlights a recurring theme in the CPA newsletter. Aviation is treated as a lifelong discipline. It's rare to find a physical pursuit where a 16-year-old student pilot and a 102-year-old veteran are actively operating in the exact same environment, facing the exact same aerodynamic challenges.
That's a great point. It's the ultimate level playing field up there. Looking at the broader demographics of this community, beyond age, though, the newsletter's President's Corner, which is written by Andy Holmes, he spends significant time on Women in Aviation Week, which takes place in March.
A very important week.
Yeah. Holmes provides a really great historical retrospective of women breaking into the field. He points to Harriet Quimby, the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, and Bessie Coleman, who actually had to travel to France to earn hers because no American flight school would accept an African American or Native American woman at the time.
Which is just staggering to think about now.
It is. He also highlights the 1929 founding of the 99s, with Amelia Earhart as its first president.
And what's smart about Holmes's editorial choice there is how he deliberately grounds that national history in local Colorado figures. For a regional association, that's crucial. He brings up Emily Howell Warner.
A legend.
Absolute legend.
Yeah.
Her contribution cannot be overstated. She was a Colorado aviator who became the first woman to fly for a scheduled U.S. airline and subsequently the first female airline captain in the country. She fundamentally altered the hiring practices of the commercial airline industry. He also details the contributions of Betty Haas-Pfister and Carol Reimer Davis, who were instrumental in developing the backcountry and aerobatic flying cultures in the state.
So with all of that rich history and those heavy-hitting pioneers, where do the actual demographics stand today? Are we seeing the results of those broken barriers?
What's fascinating here is the stark reality of the current data. Despite the legacy of aviators like Emily Howell Warner, women still only make up about 1 in 10 U.S. pilots today.
Wow, just 10%.
Just 10%. That shows a massive, persistent gap in the field. However, The data from the newsletter indicates a sharp shift in the incoming generation. In 2024, women made up 17% of new student pilots.
Oh, that's a jump.
Yeah, that is a substantial increase from just 10% back in 2015.
A jump from 10% to 17% in a single decade for new students. I mean, that's a serious demographic shift. What's driving that sudden acceleration in recruitment?
I want you, the listener, to consider the environment where a pilot is actually formed. The newsletter argues that representation is the catalyst. Seeing someone who looks like you operating the controls of an aircraft makes the pursuit tangible.
It makes it real.
Exactly. More importantly, the true entry point for aviation is not a sterile corporate flight academy. It's the local municipal airport. It's the regional flying club. If those grassroots spaces actively focus on inclusivity and mentorship, the barrier to entry drops significantly, which alters the entire demographic trajectory of the industry from the ground up.
Taking a look at those local municipal airports, that actually brings us to the financial reality of this subculture, because passion and mentorship don't pave runways.
No, they certainly don't.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We are talking about serious capital investment to keep these local hubs operational. The Colorado Aeronautical Board, or CAB, approved over $9 million in state and local discretionary aviation grants for 2026.
And when you combine that with local matching funds, they're injecting $12.6 million into the state's regional airports.
Which is a huge number. It's easy to look up at a plane in the sky and completely divorce it from the ground infrastructure required to get it there. Small regional airports operate on incredibly tight margins.
Razor thin.
This level of state funding is what prevents a rural runway from deteriorating into an unusable strip of asphalt. The breakdown of those grants in the newsletter really puts that into perspective. They allocated $3.6 million strictly for pavement maintenance. I have to imagine the tolerance for degraded pavement in aviation is a bit different than hitting a pothole in a sedan.
Oh, the physics are entirely different. When a light aircraft is on a takeoff or landing roll, it's traveling at anywhere from 60 to over 100 miles per hour on relatively small tires.
Right.
A significant pothole, a deep crack, or even just uneven pavement can cause a catastrophic loss of directional control. You could damage the landing gear or have a prop strike. Pavement maintenance in aviation is not a cosmetic issue. It is a primary safety requirement.
That makes total sense. They also dedicated $2.9 million for airfield snow removal, maintenance, and rescue equipment, alongside nearly $800,000 for airfield lighting, navigation aids, and weather systems. Is that heavy allocation toward weather and snow simply the cost of doing business in a mountainous state?
Yes, it's a matter of absolute survival in that environment. Mountain weather is wildly unpredictable.
I've seen it change in minutes.
Right, a clear afternoon can turn into a whiteout blizzard in a matter of hours. Having advanced weather systems to warn pilots and the immediate snow removal capabilities to keep runways clear for emergency landings is simply non-negotiable for Colorado airports.
There is one specific line item in the grant breakdown that signals a massive logistical headache for these airports, though. The board allocated $1.5 million for projects supporting the transition to unleaded aviation gasoline, or AVGAS. The newsletter notes this is tied to legislation known as HB 24-1235, and airports have a hard deadline of March 1st to apply for the transition funds.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Why is a simple fuel switch requiring state legislation and $1.5 million in grants?
Because it's not a simple fuel switch. The general aviation fleet is largely made up of piston engine aircraft, many of which were designed decades ago. These engines have historically required leaded fuel to prevent engine knock and detonation at high power settings.
Right, whereas cars switched a long time ago.
Exactly. While the automotive industry phased out lead long ago, aviation has been caught in this technological and regulatory bottleneck, trying to find a safe, fleet-wide, unleaded alternative. Transitioning an entire state's infrastructure means draining, cleaning, or entirely replacing underground fuel tanks, installing new pumping equipment, ensuring the new fuel formulations are safely distributed. That $1.5 million in an attempt to alleviate the massive financial burden this environmental mandate places on tiny, cash-strapped airports.
So they are essentially future-proofing the physical infrastructure of the airports, but they are also putting money toward future-proofing the pilot population itself. The board awarded $442,422 in aviation education and workforce development grants. The list of funded programs caught my attention because it moves way beyond standard textbook learning.
Yeah, they get very creative.
They are funding high school ground schools, advanced flight simulators, aircraft maintenance, technician training, and here's the kicker, drone soccer programs. How does a high school drone soccer program translate to saving the general aviation pipeline?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these specific grants demonstrate an industry that recognizes its own demographic cliff. Drone soccer might sound like a recreational game, but it requires high school students to build, maintain, program, and pilot aerodynamic machines in a high-stress, competitive environment.
It's like a stealth classroom.
Exactly. It covertly teaches them the fundamentals of flight mechanics and radio control.
So they're trying to hook the next generation before they even have a driver's license.
Precisely. You cannot rely on the current roster of pilots forever, no matter how dedicated someone like the 102-year-old Walt Barbo is. The industry needs mechanics to fix the planes, line workers to fuel them, and young pilots to fly them. Funding these hands-on programs in high schools is a calculated strategy to build that talent pipeline early.
Okay, so once a pilot is actually trained and in the air, the CPA seems heavily involved in keeping them safe and organized. The newsletter details a few specific tools they provide to the community. They distribute a ForeFlight practice areas overlay. ForeFlight is a very popular navigation app for pilots, and the CPA overlay essentially draws boxes on the digital map to show where local flight schools conduct concentrated training maneuvers.
That is a highly effective use of collaborative data. Flight students are often practicing stalls, steep turns, and engine app procedures.
Stuff you want to avoid if you're just cruising through.
Right. Their flight paths are erratic by design. By broadcasting those specific practice zones to the wider aviation community through an app overlay, a pilot passing through the region knows exactly where to heighten their visual scanning to avoid mid-air collisions.
Speaking of visual scanning, they also announced the release of their 2026 aeronautical chart, which features Phase 2 of the Mountain Pass VFR GPS waypoints. And for you listening, VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules. It means a pilot is flying primarily by looking out the window and referencing the ground, rather than relying strictly on the instrument panel. I imagine having specific GPS waypoints for visual flying through a mountain pass is a pretty critical safety net.
Oh, it's vital. It gives pilots a defined, community-vetted route through treacherous terrain. Navigating a mountain pass visually can be incredibly disorienting. Box canyons can look like open passes until you are too deep to turn around.
That's terrifying.
It is. The CPA supplements those charts with specialized mountain flying and high-elevation airport operations courses in June, August, and September, ensuring pilots actually know how to interpret the data they're given.
The newsletter also puts out a call for grassroots advocacy, specifically asking for Airport Support Network, or ASN, volunteers at smaller airfields like Fremont County, Dove Creek, and Holyoke. If a pilot is based out of a large facility near Denver, why are they being asked to care about the zoning politics of a tiny airstrip in Dove Creek?
This raises an important question about the legal interconnectedness of these regional airports. A legal or political precedent set at one airfield rarely stays isolated. If a local city council successfully imposes restrictive noise ordinances, cuts funding, or changes zoning laws to encroach on the runway at a small facility like Dove Creek, it creates a legislative blueprint that can be used against larger airports statewide.
So it's a domino effect.
Exactly. The CPA understands that protecting the entire network requires having vigilant volunteers monitoring local government actions at every single airstrip.
The logistics of organizing these volunteers and managing this community leads us to my favorite piece in the entire newsletter. It is an article by Bob Kinney, the past chairman of the CPA Fly-In Committee, titled The 10 Fly-In Commandments. For context, a fly-in is a massive logistical undertaking where dozens of pilots fly their own aircraft to a single destination airport for a weekend of tours, dinners, and community building. Kinney lays down the absolute non-negotiable rules for attending these events.
The tone of the piece is highly entertaining, but it is clearly born out of years of administrative frustration. Coordinating arrival times, ramp parking, and ground transportation for independent pilots is a daunting task for a volunteer committee.
The commandments are incredibly specific. First, he mandates that participants register early and warns against begging the host to squeeze them in after the deadline. He explains that the host has to call tiny regional airports to reserve the exact number of rental cars needed. He also strictly enforces being on time. If the group has chartered a tour bus for an excursion and you wander in 20 minutes late, you are racking up wait time fees that destroy the event's carefully balanced budget.
The rental car rule is particularly telling. It highlights the invisible administrative burden placed on the organizers.
He literally says rental cars have needs too. If you volunteer to drive one of the group's rental cars, you are commanded to keep every single fuel receipt, write your name on them, and physically hand them back to the host before flying home so they can reconcile the accounting. But the commandment he spends the most time on is simply to be courteous.
Reminding adults to be courteous seems redundant, but he clearly felt it necessary. The underlying message is a warning against entitlement.
He uses some hilariously specific examples of entitlement to make his point. He begs participants not to complain to the volunteer host if the hotel pillows are too hard or if the local restaurant service is slow. He specifically writes, "Please do not complain if your teddy bear has an eye that's popped off."
That's oddly specific.
Right. He argues that one perpetually grumpy pilot can ruin the morale of the entire trip.
The hosts of these fly-ins are not a paid luxury concierge service. They are fellow pilots who took on a massive administrative headache so the community could gather. Kitty's commandments are a demand for basic respect for volunteer labor.
The logistical strain of these events has actually prompted a major policy change for 2026. Bill Marvel, the new fly-in committee chairman, wrote an update explaining a new secret rollout protocol. Historically, volunteer hosts would start planning a location, word would leak out through group chats, and the surprise would be ruined before the official schedule was ever published.
Beyond ruining the surprise, a lack of central coordination often led to overlapping schedules. Two different hosts might unknowingly plan massive fly-ins for the same weekend in different parts of the state, cannibalizing attendance and forcing one to cancel their hotel and tour contracts.
To fix that, Marvel instituted total secrecy. Hosts now contact him directly to block out a date on the calendar, but they do not disclose a location to him, and he does not publish their names. When the annual fly-in rollout meeting happens in January, the community looks at a whiteboard with nothing but blank dates. Nobody knows where the trips will be until the individual host stands up and reveals it to the room. Marvel describes it as preserving a Christmas in January feeling.
It is an elegant solution to a modern communication problem. It forces centralized scheduling while completely decentralizing the event planning, bringing a sense of anticipation back to the community gatherings.
So what does this all mean? Why spend an entire deep dive dissecting rental car receipts, unleaded fuel grants, and 102-year-old pilots? Because examining this newsletter provides a masterclass in how a highly specialized community sustains itself. It demonstrates the immense invisible effort required to keep a grassroots network functioning.
General aviation is defined by a striking dichotomy. It's an industry dependent on multi-million-dollar grants just to maintain basic pavement and transition its fuel infrastructure. It relies on complex mechanical engineering and high-tech digital overlays to keep its practitioners from colliding over mountain passes.
Yet, despite all the heavy machinery and government funding, the entire ecosystem would instantly collapse without the human element. It relies on folks willing to navigate the petty logistics of secret fly-in locations. It requires volunteers willing to sit through mundane city council zoning meetings in places like Dove Creek. And it requires a culture of mentorship that ensures the airspace remains open for a 102-year-old man celebrating his birthday in a Cessna while simultaneously funding drone soccer for high schoolers.
Before we close out today's discussion, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. Sometime this week, consider the small, regional airport nearest to your own house. You've likely driven past its chain-link fence 100 times without a second thought. Based on what we explored today, consider the complex networks operating just behind that fence. What dedicated volunteers, student aviators, and local mechanics are quietly keeping that specific runway alive right in your own backyard.
It really changes how you look at the sky. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the March issue of Flightlines. We appreciate you letting us unpack this incredible subculture, and remember, there is always more to learn. See you next time.